I think whatever way we kind of slice the aspirations that sit within this curriculum, having the workforce and having the professionals to actually deliver it, I think is a massive challenge for the system, and has been a massive challenge for the system for quite a while.
Welcome to the latest episode of Twinkl's new podcast, Leading With. My name is Jack Wardle, Head of England Content here at Twinkl, and I'm here with Stuart Parker-Tyerman. You want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jack. My name's Stuart Parker-Tyerman. I'm Chief Education Officer here at Twinkl. Been here for about 2 and a bit months now, and obviously this is a really big topic of conversation that we've been waiting for quite a while.
Exactly. So bringing us on to the topic of conversation today, the Curriculum and Assessment Review. But the Curriculum and Assessment Review alongside the government's response released on exactly the same day. So what we're going to kick off with is, in terms of when we're filming this, it was released just over a week ago. And I suppose my first question for you, Stuart, is we were promised kind of evolution, not revolution. Do you think that we saw that? Was there any huge surprises, or do you think that promise was kept of evolution, not revolution?
Well, from my perspective, having been in education for kind of 25 years or so, and leadership since kind of my early 30s, we've seen lots of iterations from a curriculum change perspective. And although this was hyped somewhat a year ago in terms of the setup around, the evolution versus not to be revolution, I think it has delivered on that basis. I think from my perspective, and certainly from what I've been reading around the topic, it's been a case of actually, it's surprising how much they've put in. But again, it's a scenario that we're familiar with, I think, within education, which is implementation, and the how is somewhat missing. So there's lots of areas within the subjects that we're seeing additional content being asked. There's a theme of literacy throughout, in lots of different formats. But again, I suppose I'll come back to my previous point. The how is missing, but then that's down to us as practitioners, and certainly our colleagues across schools to deliver that.
And do you think, in terms of kind of, it was obviously released and the sector will respond, but this is very much now is the time for implementation. Do you feel optimistic? Do you feel as though we can see these changes through? We've obviously got the recommendations and the government response, but you link to implementation there, and so much of this is going to be around the implementation of it. There's so much else going on in the education sector at the minute. Is there anything else specifically going on in the education sector that you think will be crucial to them being able to implement this?
Yeah, I think a key point that, again, from my perspective, but also picking up on the grapevine across the system, is around recruitment. I think whatever way we kind of slice the aspirations that sit within this curriculum, having the workforce and having the professionals to actually deliver it, I think is a massive challenge for the system, and has been a massive challenge for the system for quite a while. And it might be a bit too much to say it's a crisis, but certainly within subjects, again, if I go back to my experience of starting out initially in education, the demand for science teachers, and here we are within this review, inviting that the triple science, or the separate sciences, as it's kind of referred to, they want to see a greater a greater commitment to those 3 sciences. But there's an immediate question there: is, okay, where are all the physics teachers? And physics has been an incredibly demanding subject since I've been in education. So again, I'll allude back to the how. If we've got a recruitment crisis in physics, how do we make sure that we've got the relevant expertise? And without diverting from the seriousness of this conversation, and what the expectation is, the last thing we want to be doing is teaching kids the wrong content in physics. And if we haven't got the right experts delivering it, the knowledge and the insight from an expert in that field is absolutely paramount. So it has to be the primary subject of the practitioner. But if we can't find physics teachers, that's going to be a headache.
Yeah. So in terms of, if we dig into some of the key themes that came out, or potentially even before that, if we take a step back and think curriculum, for me, kind of as a former head teacher, when you're walking through your school, curriculum is the beating heartbeat every single day. If you're really early in your curriculum design journey, actually that can pose very different challenges to you being you're kind of more advanced in your journey. There's lots, personally for me, in the curriculum assessment review that the best schools are already doing. So if we look at curriculum design, what do you feel is the power of a curriculum from your experience in schools? What experiences excite you most about curriculum design? What have you found most difficult when designing a curriculum in different parts?
again, I suppose my immediate response to that is the kind of the exemplary leadership that you need to kind of blend all of the topics and the themes that sit within a curriculum. And we've already cited the fact that actually there's an awful lot being kind of injected into the curriculum within this review. There was already an awful lot within the expectation and the kind of field of vision for the practitioner in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. So the work between the practitioner, on the day-to-day, working with the young people, alongside the leader who is also teaching, most likely in the current climate, but also the curriculum design itself. It's about how do you kind of strike that medium that's right for the demographic that you're serving, and it's that blending of the content, the theme all together, and that's quite an art, And the reality that the school leadership team, but also the teachers, the TAs in the school, need to really understand the community that they're serving. And so where does the biases sit within that curriculum being designed fit for purpose for those youngsters and young people that are in front of them? So kind of coming back to the core element of your question, how do you do that? And what might be a preferential way? Well, you've got all the data and the sets and the demographics, but you've really got to have relationships that are strong with those learners, and the talent of the leadership teams and the practitioners to take that knowledge and then put that into a structure that benefits those learners, and because they know where their starting points are, they know where they're trying to get them to. It's incredibly complex. Yeah, I think that probably does cover it, but it will always be different for any school that you're going to, and I think that's the reality of education. Our communities are unique, and there can't be a fixed mindset on how to apply it, but there has to be an acknowledgement that we've got a lot to squeeze in.
So if we begin to dive into some of the core elements of it and some of the core themes that were coming out, because this is a recommendation that has then been accepted or rejected in certain parts, but if we begin going through some of the core themes that we saw coming through from that report, one of the ones that stood out to me was transition. And actually, from a primary perspective, there was so many, when I attended the road shows, there was so many calls to arms for a complete overhaul of primary assessment, and lots of the responses will have referenced the need for, do we need to look at writing assessment? Do we want to look at SATs? How young are we testing our children? But actually what the review found and what it recommended was that our assessment system at primary is in essence working well. There's some proposed minor changes around sequencing and particularly around SPAG, which can be quite a contentious topic in primary schools, but grammar, punctuation and spelling, and how do we test that without it becoming overly precise on what is a fronted adverbial. And it picked up on all of those things, but it will only be minor adjustments to assessment at primary school, whereas secondary are seeing some quite significant changes, or more significant. It probably leans a little bit more into revolution than the very pared back evolution of primary. One of those is the introduction of Year 8 reading tests. The review actually recommended that we should have English and maths, but it was one of those elements that the government rejected, and they said we will go ahead with Year 8 reading diagnostic test, but we won't pursue a complete English and a complete maths test, but we will have the expectation that schools do that. So we can certainly expect the Year 8 reading test to come in, and more evolution over what does it look like to test Year 8. In primary, we've had some diagnostic tests for a period of time. We've got the Year 1 multiplication, not the Year 1, the Year 4 multiplication check. We've also got the Year 1 phonics screening check, which are positioned very much as statutory assessments, but also diagnostic to identify pupils moving on to the next step. Now we're going to have this in Year 8, particularly focused on reading, but that expectation to test in some way in English and maths. What do you think that means for transition, Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3, potentially around reading in particular, but just transition as a whole? What might that change look like? What could we expect?
Yeah. I think, again, a key point that you've iterated there right at the very end around kind of what change does that mean? I think those schools that have been trying to kind of overcome the headache of a term that I'm not completely comfortable with, I just want to be absolutely clear about this, is kind of secondary school ready, and that kind of mission to make sure that young people are all on parallel, ready to kind of enter their secondary journey. Those schools have been schools across the country have been grappling with that problem for years. And again, if I just draw on some of my experience and the journey of trying to implement what I always referred to as an education continuum, I see a massive value in how do you ensure that a community of schools is working collaboratively. And for secondary schools in particular, lots of hard work goes into the feeder schools and understanding. But it's overcoming that them and us almost mentality from those schools, and bringing together the fact you're all serving the same community. And I think that goes back to iterating the uniqueness that any group of organisations has in terms of their relationship with the community that they serve. And it will differ whether you're in a rural group of schools or you're in a city group of schools, and I've worked in both. The professional mindset is actually, how do we champion these young people the best? And so transition, when we talk about it, you can structurally achieve that through multi-academy trusts and in a community location, and that's a school of thought, and it's something that I was very much for in my time, because I felt you created new economies of scale to create new ways of doing things for those young people, such as joint professional development between schools, trying to find time in the curriculum, shared inset days, etc., and to a certain degree seeing the curriculum as a continuum as opposed to fixed points in time. And come very much into then that year 6, year 7 transition point. So many young people, and again, it could be as simple as how old the young people are. If their birthday's at the end of June versus their birthday being at the beginning of September, there's a whole world of difference there in terms of the actual, if we say, the neurology going on in terms of the ability to actually comprehend the teaching that's happening. And again, I've got absolute faith in the profession and the craft of our teachers and our workforce in schools to be able to pick up on those nuances. But the reality is it's a dramatic change and shift in structure when you move to a secondary school. And some of our young people, that might be in a very small school setting, and again from a primary journey, that are walking into organisations that might have a sixth form. You've got different subjects that are being taught in different departments, different buildings. So there is the academic kind of foci that obviously we get an indicator, whether you agree whether it's a good indicator or a poor indicator, on the back of SATs. But certainly kind of the secondary schools grappling with a problem that you've got gaps in the learning of those young people, and attendance can lead to that. But to understand what an attendance rate is for a young person, as well as where the gaps might need, you've got to have a strong relationship with your feeder school. And you're seeing extended transitions come into more and more. It's certainly something I've seen evolve over time, which started off might be a day, it might be a meeting with the parents. But as I've come more senior in my career, I've seen 2-week transition periods, where they've got taster days and so forth. And that's all about making sure the young people feel settled, as well as really sharing that practice between the professionals about where the gaps might sit. The earlier part of your question was very much about the diagnostic assessment at year 8. I think it's a fascinating disposition to believe that the diagnostic and the understanding of progress isn't happening in Key Stage 3 anyway. Immediately when these young people are arriving, and colleges do it as well, obviously, when young people move into college, everyone tries to find a baseline assessment, and the system suffers from the lack of belief in what the education that's preceded that point for that young person in their learning journey. And I think universities have the same issue. They year 1 of university, for those that have been to university, know that you're pretty much repeating everything at A level if you've done everything. So we naturally see this overlap, and I think Key Stage 3 has become a space that's been squeezed over the last number of years, and I think this does reassert an emphasis on that in Key Stage 3, certainly with the content at GCSE. Many schools have pushed that content into year 9 or tried to frame it in that way. So bringing attention back to saying, actually, we need to focus on a set of skills, certainly English and maths in year 8, I think is a good thing. Whether it needs to be tested, question mark. I think EdTech plays a big role in this. Because again, those diagnostic assessments, and we get to find out what that really actually means, are happening in schools all up and down the country. You've got formative and summative assessment from year 7 all the way through. So again, I'm curious about why the necessity to say we are doing a statutory approach to this, because I'm pretty confident there's lots of quality assessment going on in schools from year 7 right the way through to the preceding the GCSEs. So again, it's a call to arms somewhat by putting the diagnostic assessment in there, but let's see what happens in terms of the review over the next year, in terms of actually what does that look like. Is there a view that starts to emerge that says, actually, we've got enough, but this is the best practice we want to see.
Yeah.
And so does it then become a review of best practice as opposed to an assertion of the diagnostic assessment? But we wait to see over the next year, don't we?
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see, you were saying kind of best practice versus we're going to test this and implement it. It'll be interesting to see how much, with those aspects that aren't going to be statutory, but there's an expectation to test it around maths and English, there will be schools out there, like you say, already doing this incredibly well. How much do we lean into the best practice that they are doing? Going back to something else that you said as well, a really interesting point, one of the recommendations, kind of oddly amongst all 197 pages, was for languages. And it was to my understanding, the only recommendation that wasn't to government but was to MATs and local authorities. And it may feel a bit odd to go from transition to languages, but it makes the point of it was a call to arms for MATs and local authorities to consider their languages curriculum across Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. And it was very much saying there should be a local approach, because if you've got feeder schools, obviously teaching different languages, actually how does that be feed in? And that was quite specific to languages, but everything that you've just said has certainly made me reflect and think, actually, that recommendation really should be for every single one of our subjects. Of now we need to know, actually, secondaries and their local primary feeders working much more intensively to look at that phonics journey, to look at the English journey, the maths journey, the science journey, all of those. It was called out explicitly for languages, but actually that call to arms potentially should be one for every single subject. So moving on to one of the other core themes that came out was inclusion. All the way through the roadshows, it was the team were very clear, the panel were very clear in saying, we are aware of the significant pressures in the SEND system. We can't influence that through our recommendations because we're focused on curriculum and assessment, but we'll design the recommendations knowing that that significant pressure is there and working with the DFE to make sure that they align. In terms of inclusion and the thread of that through the recommendations, how strongly did you feel that come across? There was obviously key elements around accessibility in terms of for primary assessment. We've touched on the fact that there's not significant changes, but some of the changes were reaching out to the STA to look at accessibility. And one of the other elements around inclusion was, as SEND reforms come in, there is the need for more advice and support for schools in how to take all of these recommendations and ensure that everybody can access them. What would be your take on it? Did that come through strong enough as a theme, or do we wait kind of for more information on this one?
My interpretation of it was pretty light touch, as I kind of looked through the content in depth. And I think there was a caution there, as I think you quite rightly iterated, in terms of the overlap that's occurring around, the pending white paper, and not to be seen to be influencing or steering that. I think it was a cautionary path that has been trodden. I'll just defer a little bit back to kind of, again, my previous experience. So secondary trained, but my bias entirely has been through alternative provision and special education, working in practice and resulting leading schools with SEMH designation. And to a certain degree, SEMH is an interesting place to kind of look at, because there's such a complexity going on in terms of the needs around children of that have been identified as having SEMH needs. And I think, again, the whole theme of, well, where are the gaps in that young person's journey? Where are the needs first starting to show signs? And we talk a lot about early identification of need, and the system continues to kind of grapple with that, right? So from my perspective, they've been quite deliberate in not going into too much of a debate around actually how does the system address the challenges around EHCP. There, I said EHCP, isn't it? Again, that I'm pretty confident when I'm thinking back through the paper. EHCP, I don't think is as directly referenced. I think it might have a nod towards it, but I find it fascinating that it's not even kind of referenced in there, because ultimately that statutory requirement for those young people, once they've had that assessment of need done, completely flips how do you implement a curriculum around them potentially, because how do you address the gaps in the knowledge and so on and so forth. So I think there's a subtle call to arms from an inclusion perspective, because it does talk about transition, it does talk about assessment and progress and understanding where are the gaps and so on and so forth. They've then put that further indicator for the diagnostic assessment in year 8. So I think there is a nudge towards saying, actually, look, if you're tracking closely, you should be able to identify the gaps earlier. If you identify the gaps earlier, are you able then to address those needs? And I think that's a nod in that direction. My take as things currently stand, I think I'll be very surprised if thresholds for EHCPs don't become more steep in the new year, right? So again, is there a subtle tone in this paper that's saying, actually, how are you going to cope with that? Well, we're going to cope with it by making sure that the curriculum's even more broad and even more balanced. We're going to make sure that actually you've got the flexibility to be bespoke to the areas that and the communities that you're serving. So we have a nod in the direction of the demographics. And in the way that you previously mentioned about languages, again, that's a big nod in that direction, because it's recognising that schools have to be, should we say, personalised to the communities they serve. So by default, if you take that stance, you could argue, therefore, you're a more inclusive education setting for the community you serve, which again, that all makes sense to me. How do you further encourage that? Well, again, it comes back to how do schools work collaboratively with each other around transition points to enable both the staff, parents, carers to work collaboratively on the best outcomes for those young people that they're all serving. And again, that for me is quite a good definition of an inclusive society, isn't it, in terms of how things move forward. But the caveat that goes with that is, okay, so where does the capacity in the system come from for that? I don't think you can ignore the role that health has to play in terms of enabling a fully inclusive curriculum, because you have to consider the accessibility for all the young people and the accessibility of the curriculum at certain points for certain young people. And for me, again, there's a nod in that direction. If you look at the examination expectations and assessment, the review talks about accessibility to examinations. And again, through my career, she would say the nod was about extended time, screen filters, lots of what I would say gentle adjustments, but not radical adjustments to the assessment system. We go back to the Govial era and the conversations around actually terminal assessment, an all or nothing approach on examinations, when we know young people, find that an incredibly stressful and anxious period of time that's not going to do any good for their mental health and the build up for that. But there are better ways of assessing young people over a period of time. And so the re-emergence of coursework, and again, the diversification into the vocational qualifications, we're recognizing that we have to have a curriculum that is adaptable, versatile, to be inclusive. And maybe, just maybe, again, is it an opportunity with this review to fully empower schools to deliver an inclusive curriculum that they believe is the correct curriculum for the schools that they serve and the community they serve.
And that'll be really interesting. One of the kind of discussions as the review panel worked, and we had the workshops and we had the kind of call for evidence, was around that level of detail. It'll be really interesting to see. Obviously, in terms of what's next, is the programs of study will be written. We know that the kind of recruitment for that's taken place already, and then over the coming years, we'll see those programs of study being released. And throughout some of the recommendations, it was suggesting in some that we should keep the level of detail that we have, in others add a little bit more detail to it. And it'll be really interesting to see, like you say, how much freedom schools have to personalise the national curriculum to their own individual needs, and in that method kind of making a really, really inclusive school.
I think, I think again that's a really good point. And for me, you then start to turn your attention to the changes within terms of the Ofsted framework. So the robustness of how a school or a group of schools is able to articulate their intent and their implementation. I'm going to go back to previous Ofsted chief inspectors, and Amanda Spielman talking about intent, implementation, and impact. Making sure that is still a strong theme, because that's where, to a certain degree, the evidence base comes through as the reason that you've constructed your curriculum in the way that you've chosen to. And at the heart of it is the learner, is the community. And if you then build a curriculum around that, within this review, has it gone far enough to give opportunity for leaders and teachers and school communities to dictate that, and champion it in the way that they feel is best, that they prioritize how they've structured the curriculum. And I think the risk is we have a very long wish list, which is ultimately what I also see the curriculum review as. It is a very long wish list. But to go back to another point that was made earlier, what do you then extrapolate from it that then matches and marries as the starting point for all of your learners? But inevitably, you're going to have to top up in more areas than other areas. And for me, that goes back again to, can you articulate as a school leader why you are doing that? And then in line with that, not just the why, but how are you going to do that? And for me, that's where you then start to come up with the same capacity issues that have existed in the system for so long around recruitment, around resource, around funding, and so on and so forth. So it will come down to how creative our schools can be in terms of meeting the needs of their community, but also being robust enough to kind of properly champion the auditors, everyone else who's looking into the school to see if it's performing in the way it should, that it's the right mission for the school and it's the right direction for the school.
And it's interesting that we talk about curriculum and assessment, but the national curriculum in its current form, as it still stands for a little while longer, has been exactly the same for the past 10 years. There's been changes in particular subjects around RSE, etc., and kind of model music curriculums, etc. But the exact number of bullet points, a very short number of bullet points in the art curriculum, have been exactly the same for the past 10 years. But the way that we taught art 10 years ago
Yeah.
has drastically changed how we teach it now. And it'll be interesting to see, like you say, just how much influence and how much are a school leader able to still dictate what the curriculum design looks like in their school, based around that core of what do our learners need, what does our community need in order to succeed.
Yeah, as you were talking, then I was reflecting as well on that idea, isn't it, that you keep putting stuff in, eventually a bag goes pop or it splits, right? So if you imagine that the curriculum, a shopping bag that's constantly having things put into it and more things in, and eventually when do the handles give? Where does the size, before you move to the IKEA size bag, in terms of actually how do I carry more? And for me, that wish list, and it did add significant amounts of content of an expectation within that wish list. But it's also the willingness to change, shall we say, the model of how you implement it, which then gives you the option to think about it differently. And again, if I keep using that exemplar, at what point do you end up with having a trolley that's got wheels on it that can hold everything that you're kind of throwing into the bag, right? Now, for me, I think we're getting to a place where literally the mode of transport, should we say, for the delivery of the curriculum has to start to change. And I agree with you. I think there's some changes that are subtle changes coming through. And for me, that's the references to literacy throughout the document. We're seeing multiple ways that literacy is being articulated. And, we talk about digital literacy, talk about media literacy, talk about the emergence of AI. These are all skills that reside in mastery as a topic. And so the diversification of the learner's comprehension of knowledge has to change, because as a profession, we're still dictating it through what I would call kind of subject swim lanes, sorry. But we're seeing more and more of an emergence of actually really the cross-curricular challenges, safeguarding, for example, the golden thread themes. And again, if I draw on my experience back in the day, initially it was kind of ICT across the curriculum when I started, but people quickly realised that you can teach technology discreetly through computers, but actually the application of that knowledge is best taught through the medium of the subjects themselves. And so I think there's more and more of a nod towards that way of thinking, and a fully integrated curriculum for me is a vision that would be quite outstanding, because I think it reflects the skill sets that's required in the community now. It's knowledge is at the end of your fingertips now, off your phone, off the computer screen and so forth. But it's not so much about the need to retain knowledge anymore, which I still find it interesting in terms of, well, what will happen with the way we assess and whether we went far enough with the curriculum review, as to so much about how we do assess. And we already see universities and colleges assessing in a different way, because it's around collaboration, it's around critical thinking, and it's not so much about knowledge retention other than knowledge application. So again, I'm mindful about how far does this review go towards that direction, because the society we exist in and the workforce that employers are demanding, they want critical thinkers. They want people that can move between themes and move between topics and apply logic to that. And that is becoming more fundamental within the education system. Going back to my really poorly articulated plastic bag analogy, the whole point of where I was coming from is that you can't keep putting more stuff in.
No.
Okay, what you have to do is start to transform the way that you put content into some sort of space for the learner to comprehend, and that might not be the way we've always done that historically.
No.
I'm hoping that's made some sense.
It has, and I enjoyed the plastic bag analogy. And I think it's interesting what we've put into the plastic bag over the past 10 years. If you think about the last curriculum, the curriculum review and implementation of the national curriculum, it was so knowledge rich, and almost then other factors, so Ofsted's focus and other assessment accountabilities, have meant that we've just kept on putting more and more knowledge in there for each and every subject, particularly at primary level. The kind of intensity and the expectations of your history curriculum, your geography curriculum, but from a knowledge perspective, has been absolutely enormous. And actually, it's quite interesting that some of the recommendations, particularly for the primary subjects, have leaned back into that. Hold on, we've got the knowledge in there, substantive knowledge is there, you knowing the facts and the figures and how to do that. But actually, there was a recognition that maybe we have gone a little bit too far down the knowledge route of, for both history, geography, and other subjects. It was for science, for example, that we need to take an inquiry focus. We need to look more into how are we applying it. Like you've talked about there of, we've almost got the what do we want people to know, what do we want our young children and young people to know, but lots of the recommendations for different subjects were, okay, in geography, we don't think there's a huge amount of knowledge that needs to change, but we do need to look at how fieldwork and skills and disciplinary skills are being implemented. Exactly the same in history of, we don't actually think that knowledge needs a significant change because that's what we've been putting into the bags over the past kind of couple of years. But actually we do have a recognition of, we need to now focus on disciplinary skills and how do we actually implement that in the classroom, and pupils going into the workspace, not just understanding all of the historical facts that they need to know, the geographical facts or the maths facts, but actually what are the skills that are relevant in that discipline that are then going to help in the future on there.
Yeah, and you know, historically, you know, the strong themes that have always come out of curriculum design is literacy across the curriculum, you know, maths across the curriculum. We're nodding towards a recognition that for real subject application knowledge, you know, pragmatic and practical knowledge being applied, you know, as a learner, as a kind of a human being, is in the ability to integrate the themes and the knowledge, you know, and that's where that deeper level of learning actually occurs, because it's connecting the dots, you know, it's the neurology that sits behind it in terms of, you know, that idea of, you know, those neurons that fire wire, is we're starting to comprehend that. And again, for me, that is more and more away from the Victorian education system and the way that, you know, we continue to sometimes look at education as a production line. We can't rip it up and throw it in the bin. And that goes back again to the topic, you know, this is revolution, sorry, evolution, not revolution. I said it the wrong way around then on that basis. It is a nod in the right direction. I'm curious about what happens in the next 5 to 6 years, because new knowledge, new skills, technology continues to advance. We can't just keep putting things in. What we have to do is just equip our young people with the skills to interpret the sheer amount of knowledge that they now have at their fingertips, and they've got to be able to question it and apply it.
And we could go into so many other themes, such as sustainability. You touched on media literacy and oracy, all of the oracy in particular being called out specifically. But almost like you say, if we've had for many, many years these swim lanes of subject by subject, but now we've got those elements of sustainability needs to be fed into geography and DT and all of those, actually that integrated curriculum, that integrated learning, media literacy and understanding, okay, it needs to be in our English curriculum, in our citizenship curriculum. In the government response, they went further and said, actually, it should be in history because you're critiquing sources and all of those knowledge. But certainly a key takeaway for me was those key themes that lots of people will have championed as we went through the process and the kind of call for evidence are being embedded exactly as you say in that integrated approach of, okay, we're not going to explicitly call them out separately or create a new subject over here, but actually this is an opportunity and a bit of a call to arms for schools over, you've got your subject by subject curriculums. Now is the time to begin making those links, begin bringing all of those concepts together on that.
And just how brave are schools willing to be with that? You know, and on the back of COVID and the remote learning modelling, you know, and technology and how that's applied, you know, the whole element of time can come back into again, you know, in terms of the statutory requirement for the number of hours that should be spent in school. How creative can we be around the kind of fixed number of hours, but also the extended curriculum to start to kind of bring those concepts in? Because again, they tend to start on the periphery when you're designing curriculum, because you do have the statutory kind of bulk that sits in the middle as the kind of the must-haves. But it's going to be a brave school leader and an innovative school leader to start to kind of say, well, no, I'm going to take it in this way. And again, the studies that might well then follow and the research that might well follow, I think will be fascinating. So again, in terms of innovation and research hubs up and down the country, what's their lens on this, and how can they provide the insights to the school leaders to give them the confidence to be brave and apply it in a new and unique way that then adds to further learning and confidence to schools to do it differently. And for me, that sits at the heart of the kind of mission for us as educators, is how do we convince the system that we know best? And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean that from a professional competency level. You know, the questions that come the competency of the doctor. We trust our doctors, we trust our GPs on the whole. I'm not going to go into any bespoke kind of stories around that, but actually, how much trust do we have in the profession as educators? And again, I think that is a challenge for us. We've always got everyone else, and apologies for going on a slight tangent here, that telling us how to do it, whereas actually for me, it's about how do we nurture that knowledge, evidence-based that knowledge, and be evidence and research informed in the practice that we take forward. And we've seen that nod over the number of years, but now might be an opportunity to really kind of capitalize on that and be brave and take this curriculum review as an opportunity to lead the way and give confidence going forward that the next iteration of the curriculum is dominated, shall we say, by the profession as opposed to potentially the government-led angle.
Absolutely. And I think the kind of message there of being brave, certainly as I read through the curriculum review and you get to each of the recommendations, you think obviously we're going to have kind of slight changes in programs of study, obviously more significant changes for secondary assessment, but so much of what we've talked about, I don't know if you feel the same, but as I was going through the review, I was thinking, do you know what? I know schools that have already implemented that theme. There'll obviously be changes to programs of study, etc. But there's schools out there that already fulfill those recommendations, that push the boundaries because they have been brave. They've gone, do you know what? This is what our young people need in our local community. This is the threads we know that we want to focus on sustainability, or there'll be schools out there already focused on media literacy. It'll be really exciting to see how much do we draw on those over the next, as we get into writing these programs of study and as we implement it, which is going to be 90% of the challenge here. But actually, you referred to diagnostic tests. We chatted over diagnostic tests in year 8. The best secondary schools will already be facilitating that incredibly strong formative assessment, working with primaries. So moving on to the next steps are for revised programs of studies to be written, and individuals, organisations have been recruited to those over the past couple of months. So we can expect those in spring 2027, and then schools will have 4 terms ready to implement, and I imagine a period of consultation, but potentially before those finalised programmes of studies are released. We've talked a lot here about actually the bravery that a lot of schools already have to design the curriculum based on the individual needs of their schools. We also have chatted on the opportunities of so many schools are doing a lot of the recommendations or aspects that are the key themes already in their schools, and there'll be enormous pockets of best practice out there. If you were to look over the next 2 years and think what would be the key ask of the DFE as we look at implementation of this, but also to teachers and leaders that will be thinking, how are we going to implement this when it does come? What would be your key messages to both those decision makers at government level and at kind of policy level, but also the key decision makers in schools? What would be your call to action for them over the coming years?
I mean, in very simple terms, from a kind of a government perspective and those kind of policy shapers and like you say, in terms of the content that starts to be kind of produced from a statutory angle is, listen and trust the profession. Look to the practice that's going on in the schools, and make sure you're drawing from the front line in terms of the leadership that's taking place there, both in the classroom, front facing with the young people in front, but also the dynamism that's being demonstrated in schools in how you meet this ever growing demand in terms of content within curricula. And as you already referenced, linking it back again to what adaptations and variances and compromises are they making to make sure that it's as engaging as possible for the community that they serve. So 100% trust the profession, and then evidence that trust by actually asking the right questions and requesting the impact base that comes with that, because I'm very confident that the profession wants to shout it from the rooftops, so give them that megaphone as best you can. The other side of that is also how we build capacity in the system to be able to grow this confidence and this bravery. I think that's another interesting kind of angle that the government could take around it. So if we start to be in a world where we're comfortably led by school leaders about what's best for learning, then we should be absolutely encouraging that left, right, and centre. For the schools, I think it comes from it's that strength in numbers game in my head. If I had to kind of simplify it, we've talked a little bit about kind of the communities, and rather than looking at schools and individual entities, we're part of a collective, a continuum, or a community. and how they kind of boss the learning over a prolonged period of time from early years. Because again, those foundations in early years, if there's gaps missed, you only see kind of an aggravation of that further down the line. And likewise, we inherit the learners from the previous setting, and we're kind of not plugging the gaps, but having to add that to, should we say, the curriculum workload that you've designed in the secondary to make up those deficits. So for me, that strength in numbers comes from, okay, beyond the school networks themselves. Yeah, how are we looking outside to our community levers? How are we, and those local community organisations? How are we looking towards maybe local universities, teacher training, and looking at the kind of the complex nature of what it takes to create a sustainable education system from educator to learner. And I think I see more and more of that. You see the the relationships, the cohorts, and the partnerships that are forming. I'll go back again. I'll draw on my experience. That previous kind of teaching school alliances, and some people may remember those. Some of the foundations that they started have grown into some very impressive networks for schools and that support. But I don't think the work's done there, because that evidence base, but also the resource required to back a curriculum that has to be as diverse as what is being invited here within the review, comes from how we kind of tap into, should we say, the big players in the system. And for me, that is universities, that is educational organisations, and again, what role does EdTech play, and how are we shaping EdTech as practitioners, and demand from them the assistance that we need, and to be invitational. But then again, we're going into new territory there, aren't we, in terms of the public sector and the commercial sector. I don't want to go down too much down that route. However, there's a reality that there is capacity I believe, to be had there. So again, how brave do you want to be in search of the capacity that you need to meet the demands that sit within the system, would be my second point.
And I think that's a really nice point to end on there, of almost how brave do we want to be. So for those policymakers, how much do we want to rely on individuals in schools that are potentially already, as you put it, kind of bossing it? And for those schools, actually, how brave do you want to be in reaching out to those organisations, those local university, those local partnerships? We've talked a lot about community. I think that'll be a key question over the coming months and years as we implement this. So a huge thank you to you, Stuart, for joining me today on Leading With to look over the latest developments for the Curriculum and Assessment Review. And we look forward to working with you at home over the next few months and years as we see just how the recommendations from both the Curriculum and Assessment Review and the subsequent government response play out as we move into the next phase of this.